Welcome to Principal Center Radio, bringing you the best in professional practice. Here's your host, Director of the Principal Center and Champion of High Performance Instructional Leadership, Justin Bader.
Welcome, everyone, to Principal Center Radio. I'm your host, Justin Bader, and I'm honored to be joined today by who I think is our youngest guest ever. Sophie Riegel is currently a high school senior, and she is a mental health advocate working to reduce the stigma around mental health issues. She's headed to Duke University next, go Blue Devils, and she's the author of Don't Tell Me to Relax, One Teen's Journey to Survive Anxiety and How You Can Too.
And now, our feature presentation.
Sophie, welcome to Principal Center Radio.
Thank you so much.
Really great to have you and an honor to speak with you, and gives me the opportunity to wonder what I've been doing with my life all these years, to see you publish your first book when you're 18 and see you speaking at conferences and advocating for young people to be open about their struggle and dealing with some of these issues. What was it that prompted you to write this book, and what was going on that told you that there was a need for this book in the world?
So I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder in 7th grade, as well as trichotillomania, which is a hair pulling disorder. And what I did when I was in 7th grade is I was being bullied a lot for it. And I gave a presentation to my class about what OCD is, the stereotypes around it, the stigma surrounding it, things of that nature. And the bullying stopped, which was really nice. And what I realized from there was that the problem with the stigma is education. Like, people just don't know about these disorders, and they don't understand how much people can suffer from them. So I started writing my book when I was in 9th grade. I really wanted other teens and adults to start to, get a real look at what mental illness looks like, and to stop being afraid to talk about it, because I think once you start talking about it, everything becomes easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And it takes a lot of courage, a lot of bravery to even bring up any of these issues because of that stigma. So I applaud your courage in beginning to talk about this, and then certainly writing an entire book about it and continuing to advocate. And I appreciate your comment about education being one of the keys to addressing that stigma, to stopping the bullying, as you mentioned in your personal case. And I think especially around things like OCD, there are a lot of misconceptions. And we hear people use the term OCD very casually, but you're talking about clinically diagnosed OCD.
Yep, absolutely.
What's the difference? Because I feel like people toss that term around, anytime they're picky about something, people say, oh, I'm OCD, but that's not what we're talking about, is it?
Right, no. So the difference, and this is actually what my therapist told me, is that when this starts to get in the way of your daily routine or in the way of you going about your life, that's when it's considered an actual disorder. So just the stereotypical example, if you wash your hands a lot, doesn't mean OCD. If you wash your hands until they bleed, that might have some obsessive compulsive tendency. So, because that is getting in the way of your life.
And when you hear people say that they're OCD casually, or, speak kind of casually and without that precision about really any kind of mental health challenge, what consequences does that have? Like, when we're not careful about really understanding what those terms mean, what do you see happening in people's lives, especially people who are struggling with those situations?
So I think a lot of the times, if someone with OCD hears those things, they kind of feel like their disorder doesn't mean anything and that people aren't taking it seriously. And also, I think a big thing is that as we continue to say these things, they become more popular. And then people with real OCD might not know the difference between their OCD and, what the media depicts or what other people are saying. And so it makes everything much more confusing for people who actually have OCD. And it's just misguiding everyone else and giving them wrong information, which isn't good either.
Well, Sophie, if you don't mind, let's get into a little bit of your story of identifying and understanding and dealing with some of these challenges. What happened in your life throughout middle school and high school that resulted in the book I have in front of me?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I was diagnosed with OCD and trichotillomania in 7th grade. But before that, when I was in 5th grade, the thing that really started this all was I was at a sleepover with a couple of girls, and we started playing Truth or Dare. They asked me what my biggest fear was, and I actually said glitter. Now, I didn't know that was an odd fear to have, especially as like a 5th grade girl, but they thought it was really hilarious. And I woke up the next morning and they had poured a bucket of glitter in my hair, which was just awful. And I was hysterical, and I made my dad pick me up. And I guess that was really the first time I had a panic attack, the first time I realized that maybe this fear of mine wasn't normal. I don't like using the word normal, but in this case, I think it works. And so that was the first time where I really thought, Sophie, what's going on here? So moving into sixth grade, seventh grade, I had a fear of red markers as well as glitter. And I had kids who would chase me around with red markers, things of that nature. Kids can be really mean. Then I had a friend who was in 10th grade at the time, and she was telling me that she was diagnosed with OCD. I asked her, what is that? And she told me exactly what it was, and I thought she was reading my mind. So I went home the next day. I Googled what is OCD, things of that nature, all the information you don't want to get on Google because it's so wrong. So if you look on like teen magazines or other things that people who are not psychologists can edit, you get really skewed information. But so I did that and I became really fearful. Eventually, I told my mom what I thought was going on, and I went to a therapist. I got diagnosed. And then I dealt with that, through ninth grade. Then ninth grade, I started really stressing about my grades, really wanted to be valedictorian, things like that. And I began to panic a lot when I had tests. So I had a couple of math tests where I completely blanked out. And not only that, like I literally couldn't see. That's how panicked I was. And I couldn't feel my legs. Eventually, I was diagnosed with panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And from 10th grade to around last year, we were figuring out all this medication. I felt like I was kind of in a science experiment that had gone wrong because my first medication didn't work, my second medication didn't work, third medication didn't work, and I kind of had given up at that point. I'm finally on my fourth one now. I'm doing really well with it, and I've been succeeding really wonderfully. Obviously, I got into my first choice school. I will be valedictorian. I have all these things that are going for me, but the thing about that is, as much as I love saying that, it's also very misleading because when you see me from the outside, you see, this person that seems to have everything put together. And I want people to know that just because you look really good on the outside and have all these accomplishments going on, doesn't mean that you're perfect by any means. And I struggle on a daily basis, and I want people to know that it's okay to succeed and struggle at the same time.
I think that's a really important message for people to hear because often we think of it as a binary, right? That if someone is doing well, if they're valedictorian, if they are able to write a book, then surely they don't have these struggles. And surely anyone who does have struggles must be kind of the opposite. They must struggle with everything, but it's much more complicated than that, as you said. So I appreciate your transparency there and your willingness to communicate and to really help people understand. And I wanted to get back into something you said about some of those initial signs that ultimately did result in a diagnosis of OCD. You mentioned a fear of red markers, a fear of glitter, and I think a lot of people would hear that and think, well, that's just a phobia. How did that start to get untangled from just being, kind of a specific phobia into that ultimate diagnosis of OCD?
So I think having the fear of the red marker or the glitter was part of the obsession. And what we need to focus on is the compulsion because that's the second part of OCD. So I think when I saw a red marker, I would avoid it or I would, go to a different room where I'd tell the person to stop. But if you put it in my hand, like I'd physically throw it away, and that would be the compulsion. A phobia, if someone has a phobia of red markers, they may just avoid it. But I think the physically throwing it away or asking people to stop using it is the compulsion part of OCD. And that's when I started to realize that it was more than just a random fear.
And I think that's important for people to understand their role as, friends, as colleagues, as witnesses to, any kind of aversion that people have to something. We've heard this idea in our society that the way to get over a fear or a phobia is to be exposed to it. And I think there are some therapeutic approaches that have been shown to work under careful clinical supervision. But, I can imagine that what you're describing was not that. What it was very much really a feeling of terror and being bullied and really, as you said, having a physical response to those triggers, that were so aversive to you. And I think that's something that we as school administrators really have to be on the lookout for because to an external audience, if I call a parent and say, your child held a red marker near another child, that parent is going to say, what are you talking about? But in the context, we have to be very mindful of the reaction that can cause and the full set of what's going on in that situation.
I think the other thing to mention is that a huge part of my OCD was having these obsessions of like horrible thoughts about the people that I loved. So I had a teacher in middle school who I absolutely loved. She was unbelievable, super kind, everything like that. And I went home each night and I would have thoughts about, a shooter coming into the school and killing her, or her drowning, or things like that. And I would have these really vivid and vicious images that I couldn't get out of my mind. So that was the obsession part. And the compulsion part was that whenever I had those images, I would either email her, or if I were in school, I would go check on her. So it's things of that nature as well.
Well, let's talk about anxiety a little bit more, because I really appreciate your clarity and your ability to explain these things that, we've all heard of, but maybe have never really quite properly understood. As you've gone through these experiences and dealt with different challenges, what have you come to understand about anxiety? Because I will say, for me, it's something that I hear about more and more. I hear about people having panic attacks more and more. But I have to say, it's not something that I feel like at this moment that I fully understand. So just as we all have this kind of surface level understanding of what OCD is, and that has some misconceptions built into it, what is anxiety, and what are some of the misconceptions that people tend to have around anxiety?
So I just want to clarify that anxiety is a huge blanket statement. And I think people use it, maybe not in the wrong way, but they don't know exactly what they mean. And so anxiety can be clinical, can be just a feeling. But when you say, like, I have anxiety, what type of anxiety? Does that mean social anxiety? Does that mean OCD? Does that mean generalized anxiety, test anxiety? It's a very blanket statement, and people need to be more specific about it, because that's how we learn how to deal with it. There's no one way to treat anxiety, because there's so many different types of anxiety, which, if that makes sense at all. And then some of the misconceptions about anxiety, as I mentioned, it comes in one form, which is so not true. It comes in multiple different forms. And that's why there are so many different treatment plans and medication, because if it all came in the same form, we'd all take the same medication and we'd be, cured, I guess. We mentioned earlier about people with anxiety think that they should avoid the thing that they're fearful of. And that's been scientifically proven to worsen your anxiety. Your brain is programmed that if you avoid something, it makes you fear that thing even more. It tells you that you're in danger. I didn't know at the time that avoiding red markers was really hurting me and making my fear worse. So that's also a myth about anxiety. I think adults sometimes believe that teenage anxiety isn't real or isn't as valid as adult anxiety, because we don't have, quote unquote adult problems. And I think that's a huge reason why teens are fearful to open up to adults, because they're worried that they're going to be rejected or that they're not going to be taken seriously. So that's one thing that I really like to mention to adults, so that they can keep that in mind. Also, a huge one that I talk about a lot is people often think that you need a reason to be anxious. And a lot of the time, when I'm anxious, I'm either anxious about nothing, or I can be anxious about everything. Sometimes I don't know exactly what I'm anxious about. So when you're with me and I'm anxious and you say, what are you anxious about? Instead of saying, what are you anxious about? You say, like, do you know what's making you feel anxious? And if not, that's okay. Because identifying a trigger, and if you don't know the trigger, identifying that that's acceptable as well. So that's another thing. And then I think a really good last one is, people say that anxiety sucks. It does. Anxiety is the worst feeling that I've ever felt in the world. But at the same time, anxiety is a survival mechanism. It drives you to succeed in the right dose, like everything. It really can be a strength of yours. And that's my goal, to turn my anxiety from a weakness to a strength.
Yeah, well, let's talk more about what that looks like, turning that challenge into a strength.
So I think a lot of my anxiety stems from the fact that I like to succeed. And I think I used to, and I still am sometimes, comparing myself to other people, and that's what made me anxious. And I learned how to turn that into making myself better, as opposed to, comparing myself to other people, constantly improving on what I know I can do. So instead of saying, I came in second place in this race, I go more for the time. Like, I improved on my time by 15 seconds, and that's what makes a big difference, not what place I got, because you can't measure other people. My therapist always says, you got to use your own meter stick to measure yourself. You can't use other people's, because it's all different measurements. So I think learning how to shift that mindset was really key in helping me to succeed with my anxiety, and also using it to drive me as opposed to bring me down was also huge. So I used to take tests and think, if I fail this test, this is going to lower my average by X amount of points. And instead, I go into it thinking, I've never done poorly on a test, or I rarely do poorly on a test. What would make you think that I'm going to do poorly now? Really building myself up instead. So that's another way that I use my anxiety to my advantage.
Thinking about the reactions of adults, or the actions that adults take to try to be supportive of students with anxiety, what are some recommendations that you have in the book for things that adults should or should not do? We want to be comforting. We want to help kids get through the day. We don't necessarily want to dismiss problems, but sometimes I think we do come across as dismissing problems because we don't want to make a bigger deal than we need to, or make things worse. So what are some helpful and not helpful responses from adults that you've seen and that you talk about in the book?
A huge one, as I mentioned in the title, is when you tell kids to relax. Things like that are super not helpful. It's minimizing and it's diminishing their feelings, and I don't think that's helpful in any way. I have a whole section in the book dedicated to things to say, things not to say, and I can read a little bit from it because I think it's important. Okay, so things to say include, how can I help you? Make sure that the kid feels like you're here for them, being supportive, instead of saying, why are you feeling X? Because again, as I mentioned, sometimes there's no rhyme or reason for why you're feeling that way. Another thing that's really helpful to say is just be completely honest. I wish there was more I could do to help you, as opposed to saying, like, I just don't know how to help you and I'm not going to try. You have to express that you want to help, and that's often enough to help the teen or the kid out. Another thing that's really good to say is, I'm here for you. It's pretty simple, but it works. Or, I'm sorry you're dealing with this. You are so strong. I don't understand what you're going through, but I'd love to hear how you're feeling. Maybe we can learn about this together. So I think me as a teen, I would love to hear an adult say to me, I don't know anything about this, but I'm really in this with you, and I'm not just going to let you sit by and deal with this on your own. I think the most important thing to avoid are all the things not to say. As much as, it's important to know what to say, it's really important to know what not to say. Saying things like, maybe this is just a phase, that also feels very minimizing, or just smile. I get that one a lot. Or in a few days, you won't even remember this. You want to be in the moment with the person. You don't want to think about the future. Or you just need to get out more. Maybe if you exercise more, you'll feel better. Or you're overreacting. There's nothing to worry about. Or this doesn't make any sense. Things like that are not supportive at all. And I think people say it all the time, like, just chill, take a breath, relax, things of that nature. And I don't think they realize that the negative impact that it actually has on the teen.
So many of those sound so familiar because, again, I think we want to be comforting. We want to not escalate if a young person is concerned about something. And often, our experience as adults is hearing young people get very concerned over things that in the grand scheme of things are fairly small. Like, am I going to get to go to the basketball game tonight? Well, that's not the biggest thing in the world. But what I'm hearing and what you're saying is to not be dismissive and to not minimize and to not distort what we're hearing, but actually to listen.
Exactly.
What are some resources that you like to point people to? Maybe there is a teen who is dealing with some of these challenges or wants some resources. Where are some good places for them to go online, maybe get some immediate help? What are some of the top resources that you refer people to?
So the first one I always mention is the suicide hotline, because a lot of teens who are dealing with any type of mental illness, anxiety, may have suicidal thoughts or may have attempted suicide. And I think that's the most important place to go. It's the most serious way to deal with what's going on. And I always like to mention that suicide is not something to joke about in any way, shape, or form. So that's definitely the first place I would send someone to if they're really struggling. I also think I'm part of this organization called Here Now, which is a mental health advocacy organization for Jews specifically, but really open to anyone. It's an online platform, plenty of articles. There are events that you can go to, things like that. And I think it's super helpful to read about other teens that are going through similar things, just so you know you're not alone, just so you know that this isn't just happening to you and it's not a crazy thing that's happening. So I always like that resource. A little bit of self-promotion. I think my book is a pretty good resource. there are always like national centers for OCD, national centers for PTSD, things like that are things that you can go online and search up really quickly. If you're looking for information, I would say the National Institute of Mental Health is a really good place to go. The American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, it's really easy access. I would say things to avoid are, BuzzFeed quizzes, do I have OCD? Some teen magazines, I think, don't portray it in the right way, or anything that someone else can edit. So I would say don't go on answer.com or yahoo.ask, things like that, because you're getting information from random people who don't know what they're talking about.
So, Sophie, if people want to go online and find out more information about the book, order the book, or get in touch with you maybe about a speaking engagement, where's the best place for them to go online?
So the best place to go is don'ttellmetorelaxbook.com. And on there is all the information you need to know about me, about the book, my contact information, details about bulk orders. You can buy the book on the website. It also has all the information about the events that I'm doing and links to those events if you want to come to the events. I have links to articles I've written, to webinars I've done, things like that. So that website really has everything.
So the book is Don't Tell Me to Relax, One Teen's Journey to Survive Anxiety and How You Can Too, available at don'ttellmetorelaxbook.com as well as on Amazon. Sophie Riegel, thanks so much for joining me on Principal Center Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Principal Center Radio. For more great episodes, subscribe on our website at principalcenter.com/radio.